It is February 6, 1943. A Los Angeles courtroom erupts in cheers. Outside, fans are screaming his name. Inside, Errol Flynn lights a cigarette and hugs his lawyer. Somewhere in that same building, a 16-year-old girl sits alone. 2 days from her 17th birthday, she tells a reporter she feels like a broken old woman. She says she wishes the police had never found her at all. Nobody cheers for her. Flynn's next film opens 2 months later. His name goes on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He writes a best-selling memoir and jokes about his reputation. She vanishes from public record entirely. Here is what nobody ever asked. What actually happened to the girl who told the truth and was destroyed for it? Her name was Peggy Satterlee. She was born in 1926 into the kind of life that makes Hollywood look like a miracle. Her family had no money, no connections, and no safety net. Growing up in the 1930s meant growing up inside the Depression, watching adults lose everything and pretend it was temporary. Peggy watched. And she made a decision early. She would dance her way out. She had real talent, not the manufactured kind, the kind that gets noticed in a room before anyone knows your name. She trained seriously. She performed at nightclubs when she was still a teenager, in venues that had no business putting a girl her age on a stage. But that was the world she lived in. Nobody protected her then either. The first crack came quietly. Her father was not the man she needed him to be. When Peggy's name eventually appeared in the newspapers, not as a dancer, not as an actress, but as a complainant in a rape trial, her own father's response was not to shield her. According to testimony introduced at trial, he had approached Errol Flynn before any charges were filed. Not to confront him, not to demand justice, to ask for money. He threatened to go to the police if Flynn didn't pay. His daughter's trauma was a negotiating chip. She was 15 years old when the assault happened. She was still living at home. The second crack was Hollywood itself. Peggy had gotten close, genuinely close. Producer Walter Wanger cast her in Arabian Nights in 1942, a Technicolor production for Universal. She was selected from thousands of young women to appear alongside Maria Montez and John Hall. Other girls from that same harem cast went on to real careers. Elise Knox, Aquanetta, names that lasted at least briefly. Peggy's moment arrived at exactly the wrong time. While her castmates toured Boston, greeted by the governor of Massachusetts, photographed for the press, Peggy was sitting in a witness box. The film opened to audiences who saw her name in the credits. Some theaters even billed her first, capitalizing on the scandal surrounding the trial. Her face was in newspapers nationwide, but not the way she had dreamed. She had been this close to something real. She had earned it. And then a man with a yacht and a famous lawyer took it from her. Rise won. Before the trial, Peggy Satterlee had something most Hollywood hopefuls never got, a foot in the door. She was young, she was striking, and she had a screen credit on a major studio production. Universal had chosen her personally. The industry had seen her face and said yes. In 1942, that meant everything. For a girl with no family connections and no money, a Technicolor credit at Universal was not nothing. It was the beginning. Then the district attorney's office called. Collapse won. The moment Peggy agreed to testify, her Hollywood story ended. Not slowly. Immediately. The studio junkets went on without her. Her castmates posed for photographs with governors and mayors. She sat in a courthouse hallway, waiting to describe, in public, what a man had done to her when she was 15. Every newspaper in the country covered the trial. Almost none of them covered her with kindness. She never worked in Hollywood again. Rise too. When she took the stand, Peggy did something quietly courageous. She told the truth, precisely and in detail. She testified that Flynn had called her JB, short for jail bait. She testified that he called her SQQ, short for San Quentin Quail. She said it plainly, he knew exactly how old she was. She described what happened in that cabin. She described what happened the second night when she fought back. She had come to court to be believed. She believed the truth would be enough. It was not enough. Collapse too. Jerry Jaisler was the most powerful defense attorney in Hollywood. He had not lost a major case in years. He did not try to disprove what Peggy said. He simply destroyed who she was. In cross-examination, Jaisler forced Peggy to admit she had lied about her age before, as teenage girls working in nightclubs in the 1940s routinely did to survive. He forced her to disclose a prior relationship with another man. Then he forced her to confirm, in open court, in front of a packed gallery and a national press corps, that she had undergone an abortion. The jury foreman later explained the verdict plainly. We felt there had been other men in the girls' lives. That was it, that was the reasoning. She had not been assaulted. She had simply been that kind of girl. Rise 3. After the verdict, Peggy spoke to a reporter outside the courthouse. She was 16 years old, 2 days from turning 17, and she was still trying, still fighting. She said she had always known the women on that jury would acquit him. She had watched them look at Flynn like he was their son. But she was not broken yet. She still had her name. She still had her voice. She said, "I think it's horrible." She said it loud enough that people heard her. And then Hollywood made sure nobody would listen to her again. To understand what happened to Peggy Satterlee after that courthouse door closed, you have to understand one man, Jerry Jaisler. His full name was Harold Lee Jaisler, but nobody called him Harold. In 1940s Los Angeles, he was simply the lawyer, the one the studios called, the one the stars called, the one who made problems disappear legally, precisely, and completely. Jaisler had already defended Charlie Chaplin on a Mann Act violation. He would go on to defend Bugsy Siegel, Robert Mitchum, Charlie Chaplin again. Wherever old Hollywood's darkest business intersected with the law, Jaisler was already in the room. He won the Flynn acquittal by doing something deliberate and methodical. He didn't attack the crime. He attacked the girls. He researched Peggy Satterlee's personal history with the thoroughness of a private investigator and the precision of a surgeon. Her age lies, her relationships, her abortion. He placed each detail in front of a jury, 9 of them women, and let the era do the rest. The strategy worked so completely that it made Jaisler famous. Winning the Flynn case was not an accident. It was a blueprint. And here is the question nobody has ever fully answered. Who gave Jaisler the private details of Peggy Satterlee's medical history? An abortion in 1943 was not a matter of public record. It was not something a teenager announced. It was not something a prosecutor would have known to look for without a source. Jaisler introduced it at trial as if he had always known, as if someone had handed it to him. He never said who. The source was never established. Jaisler went to his grave in 1962 without explaining it publicly. And there is another layer beneath that question. Warner Bros. Had a direct financial interest in Errol Flynn's acquittal. Flynn was under contract. He was one of their biggest stars. A conviction would have cost the studio an investment worth millions in 1943 dollars. Warner Bros. Employed fixers. They employed people whose entire job was to manage exactly this kind of crisis, quietly, efficiently, and without fingerprints. Did the studio's machinery reach into that courtroom? Did someone inside the Warner Bros. System help build the case that destroyed Peggy Satterlee? The studio's internal records from that period are not fully public. Jack Warner's personal correspondence, some of it archived, some of it not, has never been fully examined in the context of the Flynn trial. And then there is this. A 1945 FBI memorandum, declassified years later, noted quietly that it was well known that Errol Flynn had been having relations with underage girls. The Bureau knew. They had documentation, they noted it, and they did nothing. J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI with a comprehensive private intelligence operation. He collected damaging information on Hollywood figures routinely. He used it selectively, strategically, to maintain leverage. Did Hoover's office know about Peggy Satterlee before the trial? Did the FBI possess information that could have changed the outcome of that verdict? That memorandum exists. The question of what else existed alongside it, and why none of it reached the courtroom, has never been answered. Peggy Satterlee walked out of that courthouse into a city where the studio system, the press, the legal establishment, and possibly the federal government had all just watched her be dismantled. None of them intervened, and what came next was not an accident. It was not bad luck. It was a system working exactly as it was designed to. The press did not wait for the verdict. From the moment Peggy Satterlee's name entered the public record, newspapers across the country made a choice. They chose Errol Flynn, not because the evidence favored him, not because the facts were unclear. They chose him because he was valuable, because his name sold papers, because his face sold papers, because a swashbuckling Hollywood hero on trial for rape was a story, and a teenage girl from nowhere was just the inconvenient detail at the center of it. The coverage was not neutral. It was not balanced. It was a performance. Flynn arrived at the courthouse each day looking like a film set. He was photographed smiling. He was photographed confident. He was photographed handsome. The fan mail poured in, over 16,000 letters of support from women across America, delivered to him during the trial itself. The press reported this warmly, admiringly even. Peggy arrived at the same courthouse and was photographed by speed graphic cameras with flash guns that, as one observer noted at the time, stripped whatever grace or attractiveness she might have had. The images were unflattering by design or indifference. It made no difference which. The effect was the same. Flynn looked like a star, she looked like a problem, but the press's cruelest act was not the photography, it was the language. Newspapers across the country did not describe Peggy Satterlee as a teenager. They did not describe her as a complainant or an accuser or a victim. They used the phrase that Jaisler had introduced into the record, the phrase Flynn himself had allegedly used aboard that yacht. They called her jail bait, in print, repeatedly, nationally. A 15-year-old girl who said a grown man had entered her cabin and assaulted her was repackaged by the American press using the Predator's own nickname for her. And the country read it over breakfast and moved on. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office made its own contribution to her destruction. Peggy had reported what happened to her once before Betty Hansen came forward, before the formal charges were filed. That earlier complaint had been quietly dropped. No explanation was ever given publicly. No investigation appeared to have taken place. The system had already had one opportunity to act, and it had already chosen not to. When the case was revived, it was not revived for Peggy's benefit. It was revived because a second girl had come forward, and because a newly elected district attorney saw a high-profile case that could make his career. Peggy Satterlee was not the point. She was the supporting evidence. The prosecution used her. The defense destroyed her. And the institution that was supposed to protect her, the court itself, allowed every detail of her private life to be introduced as character evidence against her own testimony. Her abortion was not relevant to whether Flynn had assaulted her. It was not legally relevant to the charges. But the judge allowed it. And once it was in the record, it was in every newspaper in America by morning. She had walked into that courtroom as a witness. She walked out as a cautionary tale. And Hollywood, the industry that had briefly opened its door to her, that had put her face in a Technicolor film and called her promising, said nothing. Not one studio, not one producer, not Walter Wanger who had cast her in Arabian Nights. Not one person with power or a platform stood up and said her name with kindness. The silence was institutional. It was total. There is one more detail that has never received the attention it deserves. Flynn's autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, was published in 1959, the year he died. In it, he addressed the trial. He did not express regret. He did not acknowledge what the process had cost the girls involved. He made jokes. He leaned into the mythology. He described his reputation as something rakish and charming, something the public had always understood and forgiven. The book was a bestseller. Peggy Satterlee's name does not appear in the index. She had been so completely erased that the man at the center of her destruction did not find her worth mentioning. Not once, not even to deny it again. She was already gone from the record, from the industry, from the cultural memory of a trial that had consumed her completely. But there is something else. Something that the trial transcripts hint at and the history books never followed up on. Something that changes the shape of this story entirely. Here is what the history books recorded. Peggy Satterlee disappeared from public life after the trial. No further film credits, no interviews, no forwarding address. She was 17 years old and she was already a ghost. Most accounts stop there. They note the disappearance and move on back to Flynn, back to the glamour, back to the story the industry preferred to tell. But there is a detail buried in the trial record that almost nobody has examined. Peter Stackpole was a staff photographer for Life magazine. He was the reason Peggy Satterlee was on that yacht at all. In August 1941, Stackpole had been assigned to photograph Errol Flynn spearfishing. A profile piece, a glamour shoot, the kind of soft Hollywood journalism Life specialized in. Flynn invited a small group aboard his yacht, the Sirocco. Stackpole brought his cameras. Peggy came along as part of that group. She was 15 years old. Stackpole drove her home from the docks afterward. He testified to that at the preliminary hearings. He was present. He was a witness, not to the assault itself, which happened below deck, but to the trip, to the atmosphere, to the access Flynn had to that girl on that boat. And then something quietly remarkable happened. In December 1942, weeks before the trial began, Stackpole wrote a private memo to his editors at Life. The memo was not published. It was not intended to be seen. It surfaced decades later in the Time Inc. archive at the New York Historical Society. In it, Stackpole warned his bosses that Flynn's lawyer, Jaisler, was almost certain to imply in court that Stackpole himself had been involved with Peggy. Not because it was true, because creating that doubt would help Flynn, because muddying the water around every man on that boat would make the jury less certain about everything. Stackpole was asking life to protect him. He was asking them to hire a defense lawyer on his behalf. His editors considered it. They discussed it in internal memos. And then they made a calculation. They decided the reputational risk to Life magazine of being formally associated with the Flynn trial outweighed their obligation to their own photographer. They would not provide him a lawyer. They would manage the situation from a distance. They would wait and see. Life still ran the Errol Flynn spearfishing story after the trial, after the acquittal, after everything. The photographs Stackpole had taken aboard the Sirocco, the same yacht where a 15-year-old girl said she had been assaulted, were published in a national magazine as a cheerful celebrity profile. Now ask yourself this question. Stackpole's memo makes clear he understood what Jaisler was capable of. He had seen how the defense operated. He knew the strategy was to discredit everyone around Flynn's accusers, to contaminate the atmosphere so thoroughly that no single testimony could survive it. He wrote it down. He told his editors. He named the tactic explicitly. And Life magazine, one of the most powerful publications in America, with a readership in the millions, with the resources to investigate, with a photographer who had been on that boat, published nothing. Investigated nothing, said nothing. They had a witness. They had internal documentation. They had a photographer who had driven Peggy Satterlee home from the docks and who understood in writing what was about to happen to her in that courtroom. And they protected the story, not Peggy's story, the spearfishing story, but here is the layer beneath that layer. Stackpole's memo raises a question that has never been answered publicly. If Jaisler's strategy was, as Stackpole described, to imply involvement between Peggy and the other men on that boat, then someone had to have given Jaisler the passenger list. Someone had to have told the defense team who was aboard the Sirocco that August weekend in 1941. Someone had to have mapped the connections between Peggy, Stackpole, Flynn, and the crew well enough to build a contamination strategy around them. That information did not come from Peggy. It did not come from the prosecution. Stackpole's name appeared in Jaisler's preparation because someone put it there, who had access to the full passenger manifest of a private yacht in 1941, who would have had both the motive and the reach to build that kind of background file on a 15-year-old girl and everyone she had ever been photographed near. Stackpole went to his grave in 1997. His private papers are held in archive. His full correspondence from the trial period has not been comprehensively published. Peggy Satterlee's name does not appear in Life magazine's published coverage of the trial, not once. She had been on that boat. She had been in those photographs. She was the reason the prosecution existed. And the magazine that employed the man who drove her home, the magazine with the pictures, with the memo, with the witness, looked at all of it and decided she was not a story worth telling. She was 17 years old. She had already been called a liar by a jury, a jail bait by the press, and a footnote by history. And now the one institution that had documentary evidence of what that weekend on the Sirocco actually looked like. Who was there? What the atmosphere was? What a 15-year-old girl looked like standing on that deck, buried it in an archive where it would sit unseen for decades. The full Life archive from that period has never been made public in its entirety. Nobody knows what else is in it. Here is what we know for certain. Peggy Satterlee was 15 years old when she boarded that yacht. She was 16 when she reported what happened. She was still 16 when she sat in that witness box and described it to a courtroom that had already decided not to believe her. She was 17 when it ended, and then she was gone. Not gone the way stars go gradually with retrospectives and revival screenings and documentary tributes. Gone the way the powerless go, completely, quietly, without ceremony. No interview, no memoir, no public statement. No record of where she went, what she did, or who she became after Hollywood finished with her. The historical record simply stops. Her name appears in trial transcripts, in newspaper archives, in a handful of court documents. And then nothing. A silence so complete it feels deliberate. Some researchers have suggested she married and changed her name, the most common form of disappearance available to women of that era. That she rebuilt something private and small and carefully hidden from the world that had already hurt her once by making her visible. It is a reasonable theory. It is entirely unverifiable. Others have pointed to the trauma itself as explanation enough. What Jaisler did to her on that stand, the abortion disclosure, the prior relationship, the systematic dismantling of her credibility in front of a national audience, was not something a 17-year-old recovers from quickly, or perhaps ever. The psychological cost of that kind of public destruction in 1943, with no therapy, no support structures, no language yet for what had been done to her, was immeasurable. She had said it herself outside that courthouse. "I feel like a broken old woman." She was 2 days from her 17th birthday. But here is the detail that refuses to settle. That 1945 FBI memorandum, the one noting that it was well known Flynn had been having relations with underage girls, was written 2 years after the acquittal. 2 years after Peggy's testimony had been dismissed. 2 years after the jury foreman explained that they simply didn't believe girls like her. The Bureau had information. They had noted it formally. They had chosen at some point to commit it to a document rather than act on it. Which means someone inside the FBI had been watching, had been collecting, had known, and had said nothing while Peggy Satterlee sat in that witness box alone. That memo did not save her. It did not vindicate her. It did not even acknowledge her by name. It exists as a bureaucratic footnote in a file about a man the government chose not to prosecute. A quiet confirmation, buried in federal archives, that the people with the power to act had simply decided not to. Why that memo was written when it was written, 2 years after the trial, not before it, has never been explained. Whether additional documentation exists alongside it, in files that remain classified or simply unexamined, is unknown. Whether Hoover's office had anything to do with what happened in that courtroom, or what happened to Peggy afterward, is a question the available record cannot answer. What the record can tell us is simpler, and in some ways darker. Errol Flynn was acquitted. His career continued. His memoir became a bestseller. His star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame was awarded posthumously in 1960, 1 year after his death, 17 years after the trial. Jerry Jaisler became the most sought-after defense attorney in Hollywood. The Flynn case made him. He dined out on it for the rest of his career. The jury foreman gave her interview. The press moved on. Life published the spearfishing photos. And Peggy Satterlee, who had been on the verge of a real career, who had been cast in a Technicolor film, who had trained and performed and clawed her way toward something, walked out of a Los Angeles courthouse at 17 and disappeared into a country that had just told her, loudly and publicly, that her word meant nothing. We do not know where she went. We do not know if she ever danced again. We do not know if she ever spoke about what happened to anyone in private in the years that followed. We do not know if she is still alive. What we know is that she told the truth in that courtroom. We know that the truth was not enough. We know that the system, the legal system, the studio system, the press, the federal government, looked at a 15-year-old girl and a famous man and made its choice. It made that choice quickly, and it never looked back. The full truth of what happened to Peggy Satterlee, what she carried, where she went, who she became, may never be known, because the people who could have told it chose silence. And the only person who lived it has vanished so completely that even her silence is lost to us. If this story moved you, if you think Peggy Satterlee deserved better than history gave her, subscribe and hit the bell. Hundreds of stories like this one are waiting for you. Women who told the truth, women who were erased, women who deserved to be remembered. We're going to remember them.